Hi everyone, welcome back to the University of Guelph Arboretum. My name is Michelle and I'm the Summer Naturalist here at the Arboretum. And for today's video, we're really going to have to look down towards the ground to meet the star of today's video. And that's because I'll be talking all about moss. There is a ton of moss growing just on the sides and off of this little trail path. So let's take a closer look at it. Moss is very recognizable to many people by their sort of soft and fluffy-like appearance. Many people can't help themselves but to give moss a quick touch or pat as they walk past it because of their awesome texture. But of course, there is a whole lot more to moss than just their texture. Mosses can grow in a variety of different habitats, usually in more damp and shady environments, and you can really find them all throughout the Arboretum. If you take a stroll through the Arboretum with the goal in mind of finding mosses, you'd quickly find yourself surrounded by moss. They can be found really all throughout the Arboretum and are an amazing plant to learn more about. Mosses differ from other plants because they are non-vascularized. So if I look behind me, there are trees, there are woody plants, and there are some herbaceous plants. And these are both examples of vascularized plants. So a vascularized plant has true roots, and the roots function to help the plant not only anchor itself into the ground, but it also draws water and nutrients from the soil, which is really important for the plant. A vascularized plant also has a stem or a trunk, and within the stem or trunk there are specialized features that help transport water and nutrients throughout the plant. One of the reasons why trees are able to grow so tall is in part due to its trunk and the bark around its trunk. So the bark helps provide the tree with structure and support that allows it to grow so tall. And these are all things that the moss lack. It doesn't have a stem or a trunk, it has no bark, so it doesn't have that at all. It has no way to transport water and nutrients throughout taller parts of its body, and that's why you see moss typically grow low to the ground. And then there are the leaves to vascularized plants that are multicellular, and many trees and other vascularized plants will have a outer layer of the leaf that helps prevent water loss. Now, moss looks like it has leaves, but it actually has what's called a leaf-like structure. So these are very simple structures that do the same role as true leaves. So both of them will photosynthesize. They use the sun's sunlight to create energy and fuel for the plant. But in the moss, it's a very simple structure that isn't as able to retain water. Another thing that strongly sets mosses apart from other plants is its reproduction. So it actually is very similar to ferns and how a fern will reproduce. Both these plants have alternating generations in their reproduction. But of course, ferns and mosses differ fundamentally because a fern is a vascularized plant and a moss is a non-vascularized plant. But for the mosses and for the ferns, they have two generations, one of them being the Gamophytic generation. And in this generation, they're concerned with producing gametes. They'll produce a male and female gamete, and these gametes need to join and combine to give rise to the next generation. Now, in order for this to happen, they both, of course, have to produce their gametes, the male and female gamete. But in order for the male gamete to find the female gamete, it actually depends on water. So water will help transport the male gamete over to the female gamete. And once these two reproductive units have met and combined, they will give rise to the Sporophytic generation. Now, the Sporophytic generation is concerned with making spores, and spores are tiny reproductive units that are super small and super light. These spores, once the Sporophytic generation has matured and releases the spores into the environment, they're very easily transported through the environment via wind. So the wind will carry those really tiny reproductive units, and if a spore lands in maybe a really sunny and dry patch of land, there's a good chance it won't germinate because mosses tend to prefer more shady and damp environments. But if that spore lands in favorable conditions like this little damp and shady patch of land I'm in right now, it should germinate and give rise to the Gamophytic generation. So these two generations will both give rise to one another, and they continue to alternate throughout the moss's life cycle to allow it to grow and reproduce. At first glance, it might seem like in many ways the moss is at a disadvantage because it is more primitive and less specialized. If we look around where I'm at, there is no shortage of tall trees growing in this area. There are lots of herbaceous plants growing in this area, and they are all taller than the moss growing here down on the ground. So it might seem like the moss is at a huge disadvantage because all of these other taller plants are able to better access the sunlight because they're up higher and they're able to exploit a higher environment than the moss that's growing here down below. But mosses are actually a phenomenal example of how being more primitive and less specialized is in no way a true disadvantage to an organism. All of these plants in this habitat are trying to accomplish the same thing. All organisms in general, they want to grow and reproduce. And yes, the trees that grow up really tall and the herbaceous plants that also grow in this area are also accomplishing this. They're growing and reproducing. But the moss is accomplishing the exact same thing. The moss is also growing and reproducing quite well, actually. This whole patch of ground is all covered by moss. So in no way is the moss truly disadvantaged because it's more primitive and doesn't have those specialized traits that the vascularized plants have. Another thing that's really awesome to consider about moss is the fact that even though it's more primitive and has fewer specialized features as vascularized plants, it's still able to come up with solutions to the same problems that vascularized plants face. So we were to consider maybe this area going through a drought, and all of a sudden this little damp and shady environment now shifts to being very dry. Well, this is a problem for all plants in general. They all really need and depend on water as a main resource to grow and survive. So the vascularized plants, what they would do is they rely on the fact that their leaves and in some cases like trees, the bark will help prevent water loss. So many leaves have features that reduce the amount of water loss that they experience, and trees, their bark also helps reduce water loss. And then what the tree would do is it would rely on its extensive root system to draw water out from the soil. So all excellent solutions to the problem of a drier environment. But the moss, of course, lacks many of those structures and features, so it wouldn't be able to rely on a root system to draw water out because it doesn't have any. And its leaf-like structures aren't specialized enough to be able to restrict a lot of water loss. So instead, what the moss will do is it actually has a very high tolerance to desiccation. It has a very high tolerance to drying out. And so when it goes through these drier conditions, what it'll do is it'll simply slow down or stop reproduction and growth until favorable conditions return. Because its reproduction is very much dependent on water being present in order to transport the male gametes over to the female gamete. If it's really dry, then that doesn't really happen. So it'll simply stop or slow down reproduction and growth until it's able to have those conditions return again, and then it just picks up where it last left off, which is also a really good solution to the same problem of experiencing a drought. So more primitive and less specialized plants are able to survive in difficult conditions just as well as vascularized plants are. Moss also has some advantages by not having a specialized root system. So if we look over at this tree, for example, in order for this tree to grow, it relies on finding appropriate soil and substrate to grow out of. Moss, on the other hand, because it lacks specialized root system, it's not picky at all in terms of where it grows off of. A lot of times you can find moss growing on rocks, and in this case, some moss here has chosen to grow on this fallen log. So because moss doesn't have any type of specialized root system, it's able to exploit many different types of substrates and grow in a variety of different places because it's not picky at all in terms of where or what it grows off of. Moss is really cool for so many reasons. They have a really interesting reproductive strategy. They have so many awesome adaptive strategies, but they also have so many important functions in an environment. Moss actually acts as a bioindicator for good and healthy habitats. So because moss lacks a root system to take in water and nutrients, it actually absorbs water and nutrients directly from the water in an environment. So if an environment is very polluted, if it has poor water quality, then moss isn't able to grow. In some cases, it just won't be able to grow at all. So it either won't grow as well or it won't grow at all. So when you see a lot of moss in an area, it's a good indicator that that habitat is healthy. Moss also helps in nutrient cycling, so it helps break down some substrates and expose nutrients that then other organisms are able to use. And moss will create shelter for animals, and some animals might even eat the moss, so it's a food source for certain animals. So in so many ways, moss are really incredible plants to learn more about and study. I hope you guys enjoyed learning a little bit about moss, and you'll join me next week for another video.